Okay, so this is about the Great Depression. This is about the start. So even with all this prosperity in the 1920s, obviously we talked about we were having economic trouble during all this time. The middle class were not getting any raises. Farmers were struggling to grow crops. They were overproducing crops, and nobody was buying them, so they were struggling. And there were many rich Americans. Don't get me wrong, but there were, your average American was struggling from day to day. So all that prosperity was really kind of a veiled curtain over everything here. So many Americans were buying goods on credit, which caused a lot of people to have debt because they couldn't pay off that credit over time. And investors bought a lot of stocks on margin or borrowed money or credit as well. And when they also bought stocks on speculation, meaning they bought risky stocks and they tried to make a profit and sell them really quick. And that got in a lot of trouble. It got them in a lot of trouble. They didn't do as well there. And then as stock prices fell, borrowers who borrowed all that money couldn't repay their loans, and so they got into a lot of debt. So this is where we set up. All these people had borrowed all this money to buy all this stuff, and then they couldn't pay it back. Boom, get stuck in debt. And that's kind of how we got started. Whoa. That was almost bad. Damn. Let me check the camera. Hold on. Let's make sure we're still in frame here. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that. Okay. Stock market crash in 1929. President Herbert Hoover is elected president. Quickly after he got elected, about 8 or 9 months out, economy really started to crumble. It really started to fall apart. And it was one of the worst economic depressions in history that we ever had underneath him, and it got worse. People began to panic, and everything worsened, and we got the stock market crash of 1929, which really catapulted us into the Great Depression. So stocks went from being worth tons of money to being worth practically nothing. And because people were afraid that their stock prices were falling, they were selling all their stocks as quickly as they can, and that hurts the stock market. It hurts the value of stocks. So obviously you don't want to hold on to something that's not be worth anything. So if you can try to sell it to somebody else, that's what they try to do. And that doesn't work well when you're working with the stock market. So on October 29, 1929, otherwise known as Black Tuesday, stock fell so much that millions of Americans lost everything in a matter of hours because they were trading and boom, they had all their money invested in the stock market and just lost everything. People lost tons of money, especially those that bought things on margin, bought stocks on margin or credit. It's a terrible decision when they did it, especially since they didn't have the money to back it up. So banks are really starting to hurt. Millions of Americans were out of jobs, and business had fired them, and so a lot of people were scared in this time. So a lot of big investors who did have money were scared that banks would crash and they would be hurt like businesses. So the investors went to those banks. They said, hey, we want our money back. Well, the bank had loaned their money out to people for loans, so they had to ask those people to pay their loans back. Well, those people were broke, and they couldn't pay their loans. Therefore, the bank can't pay the investors. Therefore, the investors are out of money. Therefore, the banks are out of money. Boom, banks are done. All right, so we just kind of described those two there, but that's how the banks went broke. It was that process that we talked about earlier. All right, therefore, investors couldn't get their money back. Banks had to close due to lack of funds. So you had tons of banks shutting down. So you have people losing money, businesses closing down, banks shutting down. All setting up for the Great Depression. All right, so it's the worst economic crisis in American history. People lived in extreme poverty, no jobs, no food, no shelter. European countries struggled at the same time we did because they had borrowed money from our banks, and now they couldn't borrow money anymore. So they suffered. They were in depression just like we were. The Depression lasted from October 1929 until America entered World War II in 1941. So Americans lost trust in Hoover over time. And he kind of, he attempted to do something to gain Americans' trust back, and he did these public works projects, which are government-funded projects that would create jobs, and they met a need at the same time. For example, the Hoover Dam out in Nevada gave people the ability to have hydroelectricity out there. So that was a need. People had to build the dam, and that was his goal. Didn't work well. It was a little too late, and President Hoover was labeled a do-nothing president by the American people, which we'll talk about him here in just a second. So Hoover was really just kind of, he got in a bad spot, really. Hoover tried many things. Public lost complete trust in their president. There was a group of World War I veterans that were promised a bonus for serving in World War I, and it wasn't due until after the 1940s. Well, veterans were really hit hard by the Depression. So they went out into Washington, D.C., and they were called the Bonus Army. So they were ex-veterans who deserved a bonus, and they demanded the Congress to pay them their bonus in 1932. There were 15,000 of these guys out there that asked for their bonus 8 years early. Well, obviously Congress said no because Congress didn't have any money. And many veterans left, but some tried to stay and protest. And they joined these groups of people that were kind of protesting outside the outskirts of Washington, D.C. in Hoovervilles, which are kind of huts and little shelters and shacks people lived in during the Great Depression outside of Washington, D.C. Some were reform protests and some were just people willing, trying to stay alive. The Army, the American Army, the U.S. Army, tried to get rid of the bonus army and ended up killing one of the veterans. And Americans blamed Hoover for that entire event, that entire action. And ultimately, Hoover had lost so much popularity that he lost re-election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. So FDR has become president at this time. So what was life like during the Great Depression? Well, in the 1930s, the Midwest had a severe drought. Nobody could grow anything out there. The dust had started to kick up. The wind had started blowing. It exposed fields, so they were no longer fertile. You couldn't grow crops. A lot of the wind and dust damaged much of the Midwest in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico. It was like 15,000 miles wide or something like that. And this area became known as the Dust Bowl, where all this dust just blew over. Tons of very famous picture from that time period. So you had a lot of poverty out there in the Midwest. A lot of people packed up and went to California or came east looking for jobs, which just hurts the market even more. So many other Americans lost their jobs and families stood in bread lines. They, went to churches for shelters. They were living on the streets under overpasses, underneath bridges, whatever the case would be. Family life suffered as children had to grow up quickly. Teenagers had to learn to be resourceful. Many of them ran away so they wouldn't burden their families with having them to be fed. Men felt useless because they didn't have jobs. Right? And women were working jobs that nobody else wanted to work because men, there were a lot of companies out there that said, hey, we'll give you your job, we'll give this job to a woman if her husband has a job. If not, it goes to the husband. So women were having to work very, very low-paying, low-quality jobs. However, the government did help writers during this time find employment. So a lot of writers were able to just keep writing. It was important in the government to kind of have this, intellectual burst, I guess. So a lot of great novels were written, like The Grapes of Wrath. And movies did very well at this time because it only cost a quarter. So if you get a quarter, you go see a movie. So you had some big movies come out during this time, like Gone with the Wind. I know you can't see it. Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. So this is the Great Depression. This is kind of what it was like. We'll dive into a little bit more in class on the lifestyles and the effects of it. And then we'll go into how we got out of the Great Depression and what FDR did for us as president.